Hey everyone, welcome to Nightmare Scene. Before we begin, I'd love to know, which city are you listening from as you hear these spine-chilling stories? Leave a comment to let me know. Alright, now take a deep breath. Let's begin. I took the job as a night security guard for an old, abandoned hospital just outside town. It wasn't my first choice, obviously. But after being laid off from my last job and bills piling up, I was left with few options. The pay wasn't great, but the hours were flexible and it was quiet. They said it was an easy job. Just watch over the place and make sure no one got in, especially teenagers who liked to dare each other to break in on dares. I didn't think twice about the rumors of the place being haunted. I figured it was just typical small-town gossip. My first night on the job started off normal. A storm was coming in, and the sky was an oppressive gray, darkening as the evening wore on. I drove up to the hospital and parked at the edge of the overgrown lot, eyeing the skeletal remains of what must have once been a massive building. Most of the windows were shattered, some still had broken blinds hanging pathetically. A fence surrounded the property, but it was more symbolic than anything else, a flimsy barrier against the outside world. The interior was even worse. Hallways were littered with peeling paint, graffiti, and remnants of old medical equipment. My flashlight flickered across gurneys abandoned in the hall, and the occasional patient file scattered across the floor. The only sounds were my own footsteps echoing off the walls, and the distant rumble of thunder as the storm closed in. I had a simple routine: patrol each floor once, then sit at the main security desk on the first floor. The storm hit full force just as I completed my first round. The wind howled outside, and rain lashed against the remaining glass in the windows, creating an eerie, rhythmic tapping. It felt almost as if the building was breathing, alive in a way that was hard to explain. I was settling into my chair when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were soft, distant, like someone was trying to avoid making noise. I froze, straining my ears. Could it be some kids who'd snuck in without me noticing? I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the source, keeping my steps light and quiet. The footsteps seemed to come from the third floor, where the psychiatric wing used to be. As I made my way up, the building creaked and groaned, as though it were shifting under the weight of its history. My flashlight illuminated the peeling walls and rusted doors. But the thing was, as soon as I reached the third floor, the sound stopped. Complete silence. I scanned the hallway, moving the beam of light back and forth. Nothing. Not even a single trace of movement. I was just about to write it off as an echo of the storm outside when I heard it again, this time right behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight swinging wildly through the dark. Empty. There was no one there. My heart was racing, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I could have sworn I heard it right behind me, close enough that I should have felt a breath on my neck. I forced myself to calm down and took a deep breath, chalking it up to nerves and the eerie atmosphere. But as I turned to go back downstairs, something else caught my eye. A door at the end of the hallway was ajar, just slightly. I was certain it had been closed before. I checked it during my round. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. The door creaked as I nudged it open, revealing a dark, empty patient room. My flashlight illuminated a bed covered in a thin layer of dust and a wheelchair in the corner. I was about to leave when I noticed something chilling: faint footprints in the dust, leading from the door to the bed and back again. They weren't my footprints. I felt a sudden rush of panic. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, but I stayed, compelled by a morbid curiosity that I couldn't resist. I backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind me, and quickly headed for the stairs. Just as I reached the first floor landing, the lights went out. Complete darkness swallowed me, save for the beam of my flashlight. I fumbled for my radio, but it only emitted static, distorted and scratchy. The storm outside seemed to intensify, thunder shaking the walls as rain pounded against the building. I felt isolated, trapped in a bubble of darkness and silence. Then the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, purposeful. They echoed down the hallways, closer with every beat. I could feel my heartbeat quicken, each step reverberating in sync with my pulse. They seemed to circle around me, moving closer but never revealing themselves. And then, a whisper, a barely audible sound just on the edge of my hearing, impossible to discern but unmistakably human. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, blending with the rain and thunder. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. I couldn't take it anymore. Abandoning my post, I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps thundering in time with the pounding rain. I barely registered the door slamming shut behind me as I bolted to my car. Heart racing, I drove away without looking back. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. As I left, I glanced at the building one last time. In the harsh morning light, it looked just as decrepit as before, a hollow shell of its former self. But as I stared, I thought I saw something in one of the third-floor windows, a shadow maybe, or a trick of the light. I'll never be certain. But sometimes in the dead of night, I can still hear those footsteps, echoing in my mind like a warning. It was supposed to be a fun, spontaneous road trip with my girlfriend, Lydia. We'd been on the road all day, aiming to make it through the quiet back roads that led to her parents' cabin across the state. It was getting late, and we were both exhausted, our conversation trailing off as we drove through long stretches of pitch-black highway. A sudden downpour hit us hard, and I could barely see the road through the wipers. We had no choice but to pull over and look for a place to stay. After some aimless driving through the rain, we stumbled upon a roadside motel, small, dimly lit, and frankly, a little creepy, but it was our only option. The neon vacancy sign flickered erratically as we parked. There was no one else around, and the rain continued to beat down heavily on the car roof. Lydia glanced at me, unease in her eyes, but we were too tired to care. We just needed a bed for a few hours. The lobby was empty save for an old woman at the reception desk. She barely looked up as I checked us in, giving us a room key with a number scrawled on a thin piece of plastic. Room 107. The walls were lined with faded floral wallpaper, and the whole place smelled faintly musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. Our room was at the end of the hall, near the back of the building. It was simple and clean enough. A bed, a nightstand, and a small bathroom. As I flipped the lights on, I noticed a faint flicker, almost imperceptible but enough to make me wonder if the bulbs were on their last legs. Lydia let out a small sigh, tossing her bag on the bed. We both just wanted to sleep. But as soon as we settled in, there was a knock on the door. It was so soft at first that I thought I'd imagined it. Lydia looked up, her expression a mixture of confusion and annoyance. I told her to ignore it, probably just some late-night wanderer who'd had too much to drink. But the knock came again, louder this time. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I walked to the door, feeling an odd sense of hesitation as I reached for the peephole. Through the glass, I saw only the dimly lit hallway outside. Empty. I opened the door slightly, enough to peek out, but there was no one there. Must have been a prank, I muttered, trying to shake off the creeping unease as I locked the door again. We tried to go back to sleep, but then it started again. This time, the knock was quicker, a series of sharp taps that seemed to come from multiple directions, echoing faintly through the walls. It was as if the sound was bouncing around us, surrounding the room. Lydia sat up, looking around with wide eyes. I tried to play it off, but the unease in my stomach was growing. I checked the peephole again, finding the hallway empty. But as I turned back, something caught my eye. A faint outline of what looked like a handprint on the window by the bed. It was smeared slightly, the shape distorted, but unmistakable. It hadn't been there when we'd come in. "Did you touch the window?" I asked Lydia, trying to keep my voice calm. She shook her head, her eyes wide. My mind raced through possibilities. A prank? A mistake? But the more I looked at the handprint, the more I felt a strange sense of dread settle over me. I closed the blinds, willing myself to ignore it. A few minutes passed in tense silence. We lay in bed, neither of us really relaxing. And then came the knocking again, this time louder, urgent, like someone was slamming their fist against the wood. The sound was almost frantic. I bolted out of bed, but before I could even reach the door, the knock stopped. Silence fell, as if the person had simply disappeared. I grabbed the phone to call the front desk, but there was no dial tone. The line was dead. Lydia's face was pale, her breathing shallow. She gestured toward the door, her voice barely a whisper. Maybe we should just leave. I nodded, not needing any more convincing. We threw our things together as quickly as we could. Just as we were about to leave, we heard it again. This time, a scraping sound like nails dragging across the wall outside. My hand froze on the doorknob as I listened, paralyzed. I could hear faint, shuffling footsteps moving down the hall, coming closer. I yanked the door open, pulling Lydia with me as we darted into the hallway. We didn't look back, racing down the narrow corridor, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. But the hall was empty, an unsettling silence pressing down on us. We burst into the lobby, but it was empty. Even the woman from the front desk was gone. I called out, the sound of my voice echoing in the stillness, but no one answered. Desperation clawed at me. I reached for the door to the outside, but something caught my attention on the desk. A piece of paper, folded and sitting right in the middle. My name was scrawled on it in shaky, erratic handwriting. With a trembling hand, I picked it up and unfolded it. Inside, a single line was written, "You're not alone." I felt a chill run down my spine, the words echoing in my mind as I clutched the paper. It wasn't signed. I couldn't tell if it was a warning or a threat, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. We didn't say a word as we left the motel, driving away into the darkness with only the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. We drove for hours, barely speaking, both of us too afraid to even look at each other, as if saying it out loud would make it real. Days later, I tried to look up the motel, curious to know if anyone else had experienced anything like we had. But the place didn't seem to exist. No records, no reviews, not even a listing. It was as if it had vanished the moment we'd left. I still have that note somewhere, folded up in the glove compartment of my car. Every now and then I pull it out and stare at those words. They make me wonder, even now, what did we escape that night? Or maybe the real question is, did we escape at all? As a freelance photographer, I traveled to countless locations, capturing serene landscapes and remote spots. That's what drew me to the quiet countryside in Devon, England. I'd heard rumors of the mist-laden forests in the area and thought they'd make for some incredible shots. I planned to spend the entire day there, hiking trails and scouting for unique perspectives. My arrival was met with an ominous sky, heavy with clouds that seemed on the verge of breaking. But being used to unpredictable weather, I ignored the warning signs. I checked my map, noting a small path that wound through a thick patch of forest where supposedly few hikers went. A perfect place for photos without crowds, I thought, adjusting my gear and setting off down the narrow, almost hidden trail. The deeper I ventured, the quieter everything became. The forest swallowed any noise, even the rustle of leaves or the chirp of birds. I'd been hiking for hours when I first noticed something off. My GPS had been working fine when I entered, but now, glancing at my phone, I realized the map app had frozen. I was no longer sure which direction I'd come from. Annoyed but undeterred, I shrugged it off and kept walking, figuring the app would reset soon. But then the strangest thing happened. Every turn I took, every slight deviation on the path, seemed to lead me right back to where I'd started. I began seeing the same gnarled tree and peculiar boulder over and over. I convinced myself I was imagining things, a trick of the mind in the quiet solitude of the woods. Yet, as I kept moving, I kept returning to that same spot. I decided to take a break, trying to recall the directions I'd mapped out that morning. I sat down, feeling a slight unease settling in my gut. I took out my camera and started snapping random shots of the area. Maybe capturing the details would help ground me, give me some perspective. But when I looked back through the shots, a chill ran down my spine. In one photo, there was a shadow in the background. I zoomed in, squinting at the faint outline that looked eerily like a person standing off the trail. I'd been alone the entire time, or so I thought. The sky grew darker as the temperature dropped. Fog began to creep in, rising from the ground in soft, curling tendrils that soon filled the forest like an eerie white blanket. I could barely see 3 feet ahead, and I started to realize I'd lost my bearings completely. I could feel the pulse of fear starting to pick up in my chest, each beat echoing in the silence. Trying to calm myself, I retraced my steps, or at least I thought I did. But the fog distorted everything. Trees blurred together, and the path disappeared beneath the thickening mist. I could feel eyes on me, but every time I spun around, I saw nothing. Just a wall of trees, standing silent and immovable. I continued to take photos as I walked, hoping they'd serve as some kind of trail marker. But after a while, even that felt futile. When I scrolled through the images, I noticed something deeply unsettling. In each frame, the shadow appeared, closer, more defined. It seemed to move as I moved, a dark figure standing far enough away to blend in, but near enough that I couldn't ignore it. The fog thickened even more, enveloping me until the silence became unbearable. I was completely alone, or maybe I wasn't. I called out just to hear my own voice, hoping it would calm me. But the sound fell flat, swallowed by the fog. Then came the faint crunch of leaves behind me. I stopped, every muscle in my body tense. Slowly, I turned, holding up my camera as if it could protect me. My hands were trembling as I took another shot, hoping I'd see nothing but trees when I looked at the screen. But there it was, the figure, this time unmistakable, standing still in the fog. It was no longer just a shadow. The figure seemed to be wearing a dark cloak, the face obscured, blending into the fog. I stumbled backward, clutching the camera, every instinct screaming at me to run. I didn't even bother to look behind me as I tore through the woods, ignoring branches that scratched my face and arms. I just needed to get out. I don't know how long I ran, but finally I broke free of the trees and collapsed onto a gravel road. I'd somehow found my way back to the trailhead, panting, covered in scratches, and clutching my camera as if my life depended on it. As I staggered back to my car, I tried to convince myself it had all been in my head. But when I got home and loaded the photos onto my computer, the terror I'd felt came flooding back. Each photo showed the figure clearer and closer with each shot, until the final image, the one I'd taken right before running, where it stood only a few feet away, face still obscured, with what looked like an arm reaching out towards me. I've never gone back to those woods. And every time I look at that last photo, I can't shake the feeling that whatever I saw, it had been waiting for me. It had only been a few days since my son and I moved into the old Victorian-style house. We'd been looking for an affordable place with enough space, and this house checked all the boxes. The rent was surprisingly low, which the landlord explained was because the property was old and needed some work. I was okay with that, as I'd always been handy around the house. There was one unusual condition though: we weren't allowed to go into the attic. The landlord had been emphatic about it, saying it was in poor condition and not safe. I thought it strange, but with the low rent, I didn't question it. The attic was sealed off with a heavy lock anyway, and I figured it was one less thing to worry about. Our first night was relatively quiet. My son, Jamie, settled into his new room easily. We went through the usual routine: dinner, bedtime stories, and lights out. The house creaked and groaned as it adjusted to the night, but I figured it was just the old wooden pipes. Everything felt almost normal. But then the noises started. It was around midnight when I heard the first sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from above. I sat up in bed, listening carefully. Maybe it was a branch hitting the roof or something outside. I tried to ignore it, but the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I lay back down, pulling the blankets over my head and convincing myself it was just the house settling. The next morning, Jamie mentioned the noise too. He said he'd heard it in his room, coming from the ceiling. "Mom, do you think someone's up there?" he asked, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. I assured him it was nothing, just an old house making noises. But the thought lodged in my mind, an unsettling feeling that I couldn't shake. As the days went by, the tapping became more frequent. Sometimes it was a soft knock, other times a faint scraping sound like something, or someone, was shifting around in the attic. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, maybe squirrels or raccoons. But it didn't feel like that. The noises were too consistent, too purposeful. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I heard Jamie talking to someone in his room. When I peeked in, he was alone, sitting cross-legged on his bed, staring up at the ceiling. "Who are you talking to, Jamie?" I asked, my voice trying to stay steady. He looked at me a little confused. "The friend upstairs. They don't have a name, but they like to play at night." I heard them tapping again. Chills ran down my spine. I told myself it was just his imagination, the product of a new environment and too many bedtime stories. Still, I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent, as if someone, or something, was trying to get our attention. The sound was directly above my room now, rhythmic and relentless. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and tiptoed to Jamie's room to check on him. He was fast asleep, but I couldn't ignore the noise any longer. With a flashlight in hand, I approached the attic door, which sat at the end of the hallway. The landlord's words echoed in my mind, warning me to stay out, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. Nothing. Just silence. But as I turned to leave, a faint scratching resumed, coming from the other side of the door. My hands were shaking as I reached out and turned the knob, forgetting for a moment that it was locked. To my surprise, it opened slightly. The lock wasn't latched. Had someone been in there recently? I pushed the door open, hesitating as the stale, musty smell hit me. The attic was dark, only faintly lit by the moonlight that seeped in through a small, grimy window. Dust floated in the air, thick and undisturbed, but the floor near the entrance had clear, small footprints in the dust. They were fresh, too fresh, and they led to the far side of the room where an old wardrobe stood, its doors slightly ajar. My heart hammered as I took a step inside, my flashlight casting eerie shadows against the walls. Each step stirred the dust, leaving faint prints beside the ones already there. I stopped a few feet from the wardrobe, my breath caught in my throat. I reached out, my hand trembling, and opened the door wider. The wardrobe was empty, just rows of old, moth-eaten clothes hanging limply from rusted hangers. But as I stood there, I heard it again, faint breathing coming from somewhere in the attic. It was slow and rhythmic, as if someone were standing just behind me watching. I spun around, shining my flashlight through the room, but there was no one there. I backed out of the attic, closing the door firmly and locking it this time. I couldn't sleep that night, every creak and groan of the house making me jump. The noises continued, but now they seemed angrier, more insistent, almost as if the presence in the attic knew I'd trespassed. In the morning, I decided it was time to call the landlord. I explained the noises, the open attic door, the footprints. He listened in silence before finally responding. "There's a reason I keep that attic locked," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not the first tenant to notice things. Some say it's just the house, but others have seen things up there. I recommend keeping that door locked from now on." That evening, I put a heavy dresser in front of the attic door, hoping that would be enough. But as I lay in bed, the tapping began again, this time accompanied by soft footsteps, pacing back and forth, as if the occupant of the attic was trying to get out. I'd been hiking alone in the Colorado Rockies for 2 days when the storm hit. The sky had been clear when I started, but by mid-afternoon, clouds were rolling in, dark and menacing. I checked my phone. A weather warning popped up just as the first flurries of snow started falling. I trained for these kinds of situations, but even with experience, I knew better than to push through a snowstorm. I needed shelter and fast. Luckily, I remembered a small cabin marked on the map, an old ranger station left over from years ago. It was supposed to be abandoned, just a place for emergencies, and I knew I could make it there if I hurried. The wind picked up as I trudged along the path, each step getting heavier as the snow thickened. The whole forest around me was fading into a sheet of white. When I finally reached the cabin, I was half frozen and completely drained. The structure looked ancient, small, with cracked wood and a roof barely holding up under the weight of snow. But it was shelter. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning with an eerie echo that carried through the empty trees. Inside, the air was cold, stale, but at least I was out of the wind. I dropped my gear and started inspecting the place. There was a single cot in the corner, a dusty table, and an old stove with some leftover firewood stacked nearby. It didn't look like anyone had been here in years. I set up a small fire, watching the flames lick up against the cold air, hoping it would hold through the night. As the warmth started filling the room, I could finally breathe easier. Night fell fast, and the storm outside only grew worse. The wind howled, rattling the shutters and causing the cabin walls to creak. Just as I was getting ready to lie down, I heard it, a faint knock on the door. My first thought was that the wind had blown a branch against the wood, but then it happened again. This time it was slower, more deliberate, a steady tapping that sent chills down my spine. I stayed frozen, my eyes fixed on the door. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. This cabin wasn't even on most maps, just an old ranger station nearly forgotten by everyone. And who would be wandering in a blizzard at this hour? I waited, hoping the knocking would stop, but it only grew louder, more insistent. Gathering my courage, I moved toward the door, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded small and hollow against the raging storm. The knocking stopped, and for a moment I thought maybe it really had been the wind. But then, just as I started to turn away, I heard something else. A faint, almost inaudible whisper, like someone standing just outside, talking in a low, raspy voice. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was off. Not pleading, not angry, just a steady, droning murmur that sent a wave of dread through me. I backed away, deciding it was best to ignore whatever was outside. I latched the door securely, adding a chair in front of it for good measure. Trying to shake off the fear, I huddled close to the fire, clutching my sleeping bag around me. But every few minutes, I'd hear that soft tap on the door again, followed by the same murmured whisper. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep, but each sound set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, the storm grew even worse. The wind was fierce, rattling the walls so hard I thought the cabin would collapse. Just as I was about to check the door again, a loud bang reverberated through the room. The window. It was open, flapping against the frame as snow blew in. I moved to close it, but as I reached out, I saw something that stopped me cold. In the fresh snow on the windowsill, there was a set of handprints. Not paw prints from an animal, not the usual stray snow or debris, but distinct human handprints. And they weren't mine. My heart hammered in my chest. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone had been here before me, maybe they'd left the window open and forgotten it. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. The snow had been falling hard for hours. Those prints were fresh. I slammed the window shut, bolting it tightly, and backed away. The cabin felt smaller, the shadows from the fire flickering around me, stretching across the walls. And then, just as I'd convinced myself that it was all in my head, I heard it again. This time, a shuffling sound coming from above, like footsteps crossing the roof. I stared at the ceiling, feeling a cold sweat trickling down my back. The steps were slow, deliberate, moving back and forth as if whoever, or whatever, it was knew I was down here waiting. I held my breath, my eyes darting from the ceiling to the door, my mind racing with options. There was nowhere to go. Outside, the storm was relentless, and I'd never survive the night if I left the cabin. I stayed huddled by the fire, gripping my flashlight, listening to the steps overhead. They continued for hours, moving slowly, sometimes stopping right above where I sat, only to start again minutes later. I felt trapped, like a cornered animal, unable to escape whatever was lurking just out of sight. At some point, I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, the first light of dawn was breaking through the frosted windows. The storm had finally passed, and the silence was deafening. I cautiously opened the door, stepping outside to find the world covered in a thick blanket of snow, pristine and untouched. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that stopped me cold. Leading away from the cabin, barely visible in the fresh snow, was a single set of footprints. They stretched out into the forest, disappearing into the trees. I didn't stick around to see where they led. I grabbed my gear, left the cabin behind, and didn't look back. Whatever had visited me that night, it had left, but the thought of those handprints and the soft, steady tapping on the door still haunts me. And sometimes, in the quiet of my own home, when the wind is blowing just right, I think I can still hear it, knocking. It was nearly midnight when I left my friend's house, the rain coming down in sheets. The road stretched ahead, deserted and slick, as I drove out of town and onto the long, winding highway that led back to my place in the suburbs. I was used to late-night drives, but something about this night felt different. There was an eerie stillness to the road, only broken by the steady thump of rain on the windshield and the soft hum of my engine. I barely noticed the car when it first appeared behind me. It must have come up slowly, headlights glowing dimly in my rearview mirror. I didn't think much of it, just another driver on a quiet night. But as the miles went by, I realized the car was still there, maintaining a steady distance, its headlights fixed on me. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. After all, it wasn't unusual for another car to travel the same route at this hour. But as I glanced back, I noticed the car seemed to inch closer, the headlights growing brighter, piercing through the rain-slicked darkness. It was as if whoever was driving wanted me to know they were there. I shifted uncomfortably, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I pressed on the gas, picking up speed, hoping to put some distance between us. For a few seconds, it seemed to work. The headlights grew smaller in my mirror, and I felt a small surge of relief. But then, as if on cue, the car behind me sped up, matching my pace. The lights drew closer, impossibly close, until they flooded the interior of my car with blinding white light. I tried to shake off the anxiety creeping over me. It was probably just some impatient driver. Maybe they wanted to pass, I thought, but even as I shifted to the right lane to give them room, the car stayed right behind me, unwavering, following my every move. A jolt of unease hit me. This wasn't normal. I turned off the highway, taking an unfamiliar back road, hoping to lose them. The road was narrow, lined with dense trees, and the rain was falling harder now, making it difficult to see. But still, the car followed, its headlights bouncing and flickering in the rearview mirror as it stayed close on my tail. My pulse quickened, a knot of fear settling in my stomach. I was alone on a deserted road, being followed by someone who seemed intent on keeping up with me no matter where I went. I pressed harder on the gas, the tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement as I sped up, but the car behind me did the same, maintaining that unsettlingly close distance. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the car's headlights flicked off. I was plunged into near darkness, my own headlights the only thing illuminating the rain-drenched road ahead. I glanced back, squinting into the inky blackness, but saw nothing. No headlights, no sign of the car. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. I exhaled shakily, telling myself I'd lost them. Maybe they'd turned off, or maybe it had all been a misunderstanding. The relief washed over me in waves as I continued driving, my heartbeat slowly returning to normal. But then a sharp glint caught my eye in the rearview mirror. The headlights were back, closer than ever, so close that I could see the shadow of a figure behind the wheel. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline of a person, rigid and unmoving, eyes seemingly fixed on me through the rain-streaked windshield. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they were deliberately playing with me, toying with my sense of safety. Every nerve in my body screamed to get away. I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the narrow, winding road. The trees blurred by as my car hurtled forward, my grip on the steering wheel white-knuckled. I drove for what felt like an eternity, but no matter how fast I went, the car kept pace, trailing me like a shadow. The rain grew heavier, thunder rumbling in the distance, and the road ahead looked more ominous, the shadows of the trees looming like twisted, skeletal figures. I turned sharply at the next intersection, nearly skidding off the road in my desperation. But the car followed, its headlights flickering ominously as it matched my every move. I began to panic, my mind racing with questions. Who was driving that car? And why were they so intent on following me? I considered pulling over, but the thought of stopping, of facing whoever was in that car, filled me with a cold dread. Just then, a small gas station appeared up ahead, its neon sign glowing faintly through the sheets of rain. I didn't hesitate. I pulled in, tires screeching as I came to an abrupt halt under the gas station's lone, flickering light. My heart pounded as I watched the road, waiting to see if the car would follow. But it didn't. I sat there, my hands still clutching the wheel, waiting and watching as the rain pattered softly on the roof. The road was empty, silent except for the distant rumble of thunder. I took a deep breath, my nerves still on edge, glancing around the darkened gas station, hoping to see a clerk, another car, anything that would make me feel less alone. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That I'd been followed by a car that had mysteriously disappeared? I shook my head, feeling ridiculous. Maybe it was just my imagination or a strange coincidence. But as I sat there trying to calm down, something caught my eye. A set of wet footprints on the pavement outside my window. They led from the edge of the gas station lot, stopping just a few feet from my car door. They were fresh, glistening in the rain, and large enough that I knew they hadn't been there when I pulled in. My stomach twisted as I realized someone had been standing there, just outside my car, watching me. I didn't stay to find out more. I threw the car into reverse, backed out of the lot, and drove home as fast as I could, refusing to look back. The rain pounded harder as I sped down the road, my headlights cutting through the darkness, but the road behind me remained empty. I didn't see the car again after that night. But sometimes on long drives home, when the road is quiet and deserted, I catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights appear out of the darkness, following me, always just a little too close. After a rough breakup, I decided to get away for a while. I found a bed and breakfast in an old historic inn on the outskirts of a small town. It was a sprawling Victorian mansion, complete with creaking floorboards, grand staircases, and the unmistakable scent of old wood and dust. The inn had a strange charm, as if the walls were filled with stories and secrets. I needed a change of scenery, and this place seemed to offer exactly that. The owner, a reserved elderly woman, showed me to my room on the second floor. The room was simple: an antique bed, a wooden dresser, a large mirror, and a single window looking out over the quiet garden. As she left, she gave me a warning that I laughed off at the time. She said that if I heard anything unusual, I should ignore it and stay in bed. It sounded ridiculous, but there was a strange seriousness in her eyes that stuck with me. I settled in, unpacked a few things, and read for a bit before turning in. That first night was quiet, aside from the occasional creak of the floorboards. I'd almost drifted off when I heard it, a faint whisper like someone murmuring softly. I sat up, straining to hear, but the sound faded, replaced by silence. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in a strange place, and I was still wound up from the stress of everything. But as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The room felt charged, as though someone were watching me from the shadows. The second night, it happened again. I just turned off the light and pulled the covers up when I heard the whispering, clearer this time. The voice was low, almost pleading, but the words were too soft to make out. My heart pounded as I lay frozen, ears straining to catch any familiar syllable. I held my breath, hoping it would stop, but the whispering continued, persistent and rhythmic, like someone standing just out of sight, speaking softly to themselves. I thought of the owner's warning. "Ignore it and stay in bed," she'd said. The advice now seemed oddly specific, and I wondered if she'd heard this whispering before. I tried to shake off the fear and forced myself to stay put, lying as still as I could. But as the minutes dragged on, the whispering grew louder, almost frantic. I felt my skin crawl as it seemed to move closer, circling the bed as if searching for something or someone. My hands gripped the covers, knuckles white. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for it to stop. Eventually, it did, fading back into silence, but it took a long time before I could relax enough to sleep. On the third night, I was already tense, dreading the whispering before it even started. I lay there, fully awake, staring at the ceiling and counting the seconds. But tonight, the whispers started almost immediately, as if they'd been waiting for me. I tried to ignore them, focusing on breathing slowly and evenly. But this time something changed. The voice grew clearer, almost distinct, and for the first time I could make out words, desperate and pleading, as though someone were begging for help. "Please, please," the voice murmured, barely above a whisper, but the sorrow in it was unmistakable. I couldn't take it any longer. Ignoring the owner's warning, I got up, turning on the light and scanning the room. It was empty. Just the bed, the dresser, the mirror, and the window. The whispering had stopped the moment I turned on the light, leaving a heavy silence in its place. But something felt off. The mirror on the wall seemed wrong. It felt like it was watching me, as though eyes were hidden behind the glass. I stepped closer, my reflection staring back at me, pale and tense. But as I looked more closely, I felt a strange sensation, like I was being drawn toward the mirror. My own reflection seemed to shift, the edges of my face softening, blurring slightly. And then I saw it, behind my reflection, faint but unmistakable. A shadow hovering just over my shoulder, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It was as though someone were standing right behind me, staring back through the glass. I spun around, but the room was empty. Heart pounding, I backed away from the mirror, refusing to look at it again. I left the light on that night, lying in bed with my eyes fixed on the ceiling, too scared to close them. The whispering didn't return, but the silence was worse, heavy and oppressive, as if the presence in the mirror was still watching me, waiting. The next morning, I went to the innkeeper, determined to get answers. I told her about the whispering, the feeling of someone watching me, the shadow in the mirror. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, pity mixed with fear. She took a deep breath before speaking. "You're not the first to experience strange things in that room," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She explained that years ago, a guest had gone missing from that very room, simply disappearing without a trace. They searched everywhere, but she was never found. Some say her spirit remained trapped, endlessly searching for a way out. I checked out that day, unable to stay another night. But even now, I sometimes feel that same presence, especially in the quiet hours of the night. Every time I pass a mirror, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow hovering behind me, just out of sight. And sometimes in the dead of night, I swear I still hear that faint, desperate whisper, "Please, please." Every summer, I rent a small cabin by Lake Ravenwood. It's a secluded spot, surrounded by dense woods and miles away from the nearest town. I go there to get away from everything, to clear my head and escape the noise of daily life. I've been going there for years, and until this past summer, I'd always felt at peace there. This time, I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the lake. As usual, the cabin was just as I'd left it, a bit dusty but familiar. I unpacked, fixed myself a small meal, and then settled on the porch to watch the sunset. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the darkening sky like a mirror, and a calm silence settled over the woods as the last rays of light disappeared behind the trees. I went to bed early that night, tired from the drive and ready for a good night's sleep. But something woke me around midnight. I lay there for a moment, listening, trying to figure out what it was. And then I heard it, soft, shuffling footsteps on the gravel path outside the cabin. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. It sounded like someone walking slowly, deliberately. I sat up and peered out the window, but the night was pitch black, with no sign of movement. Telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer wandering close to the cabin, I lay back down. But sleep didn't come easily, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning I went outside to check. The gravel path was undisturbed, no signs of footprints, nothing to indicate anyone had been near the cabin. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and spent the day hiking and exploring, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. By evening, I'd almost forgotten about it, but that night it happened again. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard the same footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. This time they stopped right outside my window. I held my breath, the hair on the back of my neck prickling as I listened to the soft crunch of gravel just a few feet away. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting for whatever it was to move away. But it stayed there just outside the window, unmoving. Finally, I gathered the courage to reach for my flashlight. I shone it out the window, expecting to see nothing but trees. But to my shock, I saw a trail of wet footprints, leading from the lake's edge right up to my window. They were fresh, glistening in the moonlight, and seemed to disappear back into the woods. The realization hit me hard. Someone or something had been watching me. I shut the flashlight off and forced myself to calm down, telling myself it was just a prank, maybe some kids messing around. But who would be out here miles from town in the dead of night? The next day, I searched the area around the cabin. There were no other footprints by the lake and no sign of anyone nearby. I walked along the shoreline, hoping to find some rational explanation, but all I found were my own tracks from the day before. That night, I decided to stay awake just to be sure I wasn't imagining things. I sat by the window with the flashlight in hand, listening to the sounds of the forest, each creak and rustle magnified in the quiet. The hours passed, and just as I started to think nothing would happen, I heard it again. The same slow, dragging footsteps on the gravel path, moving closer to the cabin. My pulse quickened as the steps stopped directly outside the door. This time they didn't just stop. I heard a soft scraping like someone, or something, was running a hand along the wood, feeling its way around. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight tightly. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I waited in the tense silence, every nerve on edge. I knew I should check outside, but something in me, the same gut instinct that had kept me rooted in place, kept me from moving. The following morning, I found more wet footprints leading up to the cabin. They were clearer now, each print larger than my own, and spaced close together as if someone had been pacing around the cabin, circling it in the dark. They stopped directly outside my window, just like before, but there were no tracks leading away. I was rattled. The idea of staying another night felt wrong, but I'd come here to clear my mind, to get away. Running back to the city over some footprints felt irrational. I convinced myself it was all just my nerves and decided to stay, trying to focus on the lake and the serenity of the woods. But that night, the footsteps returned, this time even louder. They circled the cabin, moving from window to window, pausing at each one as if searching for a way in. I lay still in bed, too terrified to even reach for the flashlight. The steps grew slower, more methodical, dragging across the gravel like whoever it was had all the time in the world. And then, as the footsteps stopped outside my door, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. A soft, wet whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. Sounded like my name. That was it. I grabbed my bag, flashlight in hand, and made my way out the back window. I didn't care where I went as long as it was away from that cabin. I stumbled through the woods, heart racing. until I reached my car and drove off without looking back. It's been months since that night, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear those footsteps, slow and shuffling, like something, or someone, is still searching, calling my name in the darkness by the lake. When I took the night shift at the gas station, I didn't think much of it. It was quiet work, mostly stocking shelves, manning the register, and dealing with the occasional customer. Most people just wanted to fill up and leave as quickly as possible, and I liked the solitude. The station was located off a long, empty stretch of road surrounded by dense woods. I'd work from midnight until dawn, then head home just as the sun rose. It was around 2 a.m. one night when the strange thing started happening. I was leaning against the counter, half asleep, when the door chime rang. A chill ran through the room as the door opened, even though no one stepped inside. I waited, expecting someone to walk in, but the door just swung shut on its own. I peered outside, thinking maybe it was the wind, but the air was perfectly still. The next few nights were uneventful, and I almost forgot about it. But a week later, something else happened. The lights flickered, dimming to a dull glow, then slowly brightening again. I'd seen electrical issues before, but this felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, even though I was alone. Around 3 a.m., I went outside to check the pumps, hoping the fresh air would calm my nerves. The lot was empty, save for the shadows cast by the flickering lights. I was about to go back inside when I noticed something on the ground, footprints. They were large, fresh, and led from the woods to the pumps, but stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, maybe a prank from some bored teenager. But deep down, I knew there was something off about this place. That night, I kept looking over my shoulder, checking the security cameras every few minutes. Nothing unusual showed up on the footage, just the empty lot and the faint glow of the lights. A few nights later, things escalated. It was another quiet shift. I was sitting at the counter, scrolling through my phone, when the lights flickered again, this time more violently. Suddenly, every monitor in the store went black, replaced by static. I froze, staring at the screens, hoping it was a glitch. Then, through the static, something moved, just a blur at first, but it slowly grew clearer. A figure standing still in the middle of the lot, just beyond the reach of the lights. My heart pounded as I squinted at the screen, trying to make out details. The figure didn't move, didn't step closer, just stood there, staring directly at the camera. It was too far to make out a face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unsettling. I looked out the window, but the lot was empty, nothing but darkness beyond the pumps. I turned back to the screen, but the figure was gone. I rewound the footage, but there was nothing there, just static. I tried to calm down, telling myself I'd imagined it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next hour dragged by, every creak of the station settling, making me jump. At around 4 a.m., just when I thought I could finally relax, the door chime rang. I looked up, expecting to see a customer, but the store was empty. The door had swung open on its own again. As I watched, it closed slowly, almost deliberately. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I fought the urge to run. I was about to go check the door when the phone rang. Startled, I grabbed the receiver, pressing it to my ear. At first, there was only silence, a heavy, oppressive quiet that filled my head. Then I heard a faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. My pulse quickened, and I slammed the phone down, heart pounding. I glanced at the monitors, half expecting to see the figure again, but the screens were blank, flickering slightly as if taunting me. I spent the rest of the shift wide awake, flinching at every noise, waiting for something to happen. But the store remained quiet, and when dawn finally broke, I locked up and drove home as fast as I could. I almost called in sick for my next shift, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to believe it had all been a bad dream, some late-night hallucination brought on by exhaustion. I arrived at the station just before midnight, everything seemingly normal. The hours passed quietly and I started to relax, thinking maybe it had been all in my head. But around 2 a.m., the lights flickered again. This time, the monitors didn't show static. Instead, they all displayed the same image, a live feed of the lot outside. I watched as something moved into view, emerging slowly from the shadows. It was the same figure standing just beyond the pumps, closer now. My throat tightened as I watched it stand there, still and silent, barely visible in the dim light. I glanced out the window, but there was nothing. I turned back to the monitors and the figure was gone. Then the door chime rang. This time I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys and left the station, leaving the lights and monitors flickering behind me. I drove home with white knuckles, unable to shake the feeling that I was being followed. The next morning I called the owner and quit. I didn't give him a reason, I just couldn't go back. But even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of that figure, the shadow standing in the darkness just beyond the gas pumps. And sometimes late at night, when I'm alone in my own home, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of the door chime, echoing in my mind. Last summer, I was on a cross-country road trip, making my way through a stretch of quiet desert highway at night. I'd been driving for hours when exhaustion finally hit, so I decided to stop at the first place I could find, a small, weathered roadside motel in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't ideal, but the thought of a few hours of sleep was too tempting to resist. The motel was nearly empty, save for a few cars scattered across the parking lot. I went inside and was greeted by an elderly man at the front desk who barely looked up as he handed me the key to room 6. His only words were a muttered good night as he returned to the small television blaring in the corner. I thanked him, took my key, and made my way to the room. Room 6 was as basic as they come. A small bed with faded sheets, a cracked mirror, and a lone, flickering lamp on the nightstand. The walls were thin, and I could faintly hear the sound of a television playing in the room next door. I didn't think much of it. I was too tired to care. After a quick shower, I climbed into bed, ready to drift off. But as soon as I turned off the light, I heard a soft knock on the door. I froze, staring at the door in the dim light from the window, wondering who could be out there at this hour. I waited, thinking maybe it was a mistake, that whoever it was would go away. The knock came again, a bit louder this time. I felt a chill run down my spine as I sat up, unsure whether to open it or ignore it. Finally, I called out, "Who is it?" No response. Silence filled the room, thick and tense, and I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But just as I lay back down, the knock came once more, insistent and closer this time, as though whoever it was pressing their face against the door, listening for movement inside. Uneasy, I slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole. Outside, the hallway was empty, just dimly lit by a flickering fluorescent light. I scanned the area, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease, and returned to bed, telling myself it was probably just some other guest playing a prank. But the peace didn't last. Just as I was starting to relax, I heard the doorknob rattle, softly at first, then with more force. Someone was trying to open the door. I sat up, my pulse quickening as I stared at the knob, watching as it twisted back and forth. Whoever was on the other side was determined. I felt a surge of panic. I checked the lock, making sure it was secure, and backed away, hoping they'd leave. The rattling continued for a few more seconds before it stopped, leaving an unsettling silence in its place. I let out a shaky breath, hoping that was the end of it. But then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something on the window. At first, it was just a shadow, but as I looked closer, I realized it was a face, pressed up against the glass, staring in. I jumped back, heart racing, and grabbed my phone, frantically dialing the front desk. The line rang a few times before the same elderly man picked up, sounding half asleep. I quickly explained that someone was outside my room trying to get in. There was a pause, then a long sigh before he spoke. "There's no one out there," he said, his tone flat, almost annoyed. "You're the only guest in that wing." I stammered, trying to explain, but he cut me off. "Just go back to bed," he said, and hung up. I felt a surge of frustration but also fear. I peeked out the window, and to my horror, the face was still there. The figure was standing so close to the glass that I could see their breath fogging it up, creating small patches of condensation. Their face was obscured in shadow, but I could tell they were staring directly at me, their gaze unblinking and intent. I backed away, unable to tear my eyes from the window. I wanted to leave, but my keys were on the nightstand, far too close to the window. As I stood there, paralyzed, the figure lifted a hand and slowly traced a line down the glass, creating a faint, chilling squeak as their fingers slid across the pane. In a burst of desperation, I grabbed my keys and phone, darting toward the door. I didn't care if the man at the desk thought I was overreacting. I just needed to get out. I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway, keeping my eyes on the window, but the figure was gone. The hallway was empty, eerily quiet, save for the faint buzz of the overhead light. I hurried to the front desk, heart pounding. The old man looked up as I approached, his eyes tired but unreadable. I told him again about the person outside my window, the knocking, the face pressed against the glass. He listened in silence, his expression never changing. When I finished, he just sighed and shook his head. "There's no one here but you," he repeated. "Haven't had anyone in room 6 for years. Not since, well, never mind." I pressed him for details, but he only muttered something under his breath and handed me my receipt. He didn't look up as I took it, and I realized I wouldn't get anything more out of him. I left the motel without another word, feeling his eyes on me as I walked out into the night. I climbed into my car and drove off, not daring to look back. A few hours later, when I stopped to fill up my tank, I found a single handprint on the back window of my car, smeared and faint, like someone had been holding on, watching as I drove away. After moving into my new apartment, I noticed something strange about the layout. The place was spacious and well-lit, but there was one thing that unsettled me: an old, floor-length mirror in the hallway. It wasn't just any mirror. It was tall and heavy, with a dark wooden frame that looked almost out of place in the modern apartment. The previous tenants had left it behind, and I figured they simply hadn't wanted the hassle of moving it. I tried not to think about it too much, but every time I passed the mirror, I felt a strange pull, like I was being watched. Whenever I looked into it, I had the eerie feeling that my reflection was somehow off. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong, but something about the image staring back felt unnatural. I brushed it off as nerves from moving to a new place. The first week passed without incident, but on the 7th night, something happened that shook me to my core. It was around midnight, and I just turned off the lights to go to bed. As I walked past the mirror in the dark, I caught a glimpse of something that stopped me dead in my tracks. In the reflection, my reflection wasn't following my movements. Instead, it stood completely still, watching me as I passed. My heart raced as I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the dim light. But when I looked again, the reflection moved, turning its head to face me in slow, deliberate motions. I backed away, feeling a chill run down my spine. It was as if the figure in the mirror had a mind of its own. I hurried to my room, closed the door, and tried to shake off the image. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the result of a long day. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep, but the unease lingered. The next day, I avoided the mirror as much as possible. I told myself it was silly, just a mirror, nothing more. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I felt compelled to look again, to see if what I'd seen was real or just my mind playing tricks. This time, I stared into the mirror carefully, studying my reflection. It looked normal, just me standing there, no unusual movement. I let out a breath, feeling almost foolish for scaring myself over nothing. But as I turned to walk away, I noticed something chilling. My reflection hadn't turned with me. It was still facing the mirror, watching, with a slight smile that hadn't been there before. I froze, my pulse quickening. I turned back to face the mirror, and only then did my reflection start to mirror my movements again, the smile fading into a neutral expression. I couldn't understand it. Was this some kind of optical illusion? Or was I losing my mind? I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the reflection until I was out of the hallway and into my bedroom. The following nights were worse. Every time I passed the mirror at night, my reflection seemed slower, more deliberate, as if it was aware of my presence. It was subtle, a delay in movement here, an odd tilt of the head there, but enough to make my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, but the fear grew, gnawing at me. Then one night I heard a faint tapping sound. It was a soft, rhythmic tap, echoing down the hallway, coming from the mirror. I stood frozen, staring at the closed bedroom door, listening to the taps that sounded like fingernails gently rapping against glass. I knew I should stay in bed, ignore it, but something in me couldn't resist. I slowly opened the door, peeking down the hallway. The mirror was there, as it always was, standing silent and cold. But as I took a step closer, the tapping stopped. The hallway was empty, but the air felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I stood in front of the mirror, heart pounding, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, slowly, my reflection's hand lifted. My own hands were hanging by my sides, but in the mirror, my reflection raised one hand, placing it gently against the glass. My breath hitched. I didn't move, but my reflection kept staring, pressing its palm to the inside of the mirror as if trying to reach out to me. I watched in horror, unable to move as it leaned forward, its expression darkening. Just as I was about to scream, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out. I stumbled backward, reaching for my phone flashlight, and in the split second before the light went out, I saw it. My reflection smiling, wide and unnatural, teeth bared in a grin that didn't belong to me. I bolted to my room, slamming the door shut and barricading myself inside. I didn't sleep at all that night, every creak and groan of the apartment making my heart race. The next morning, I contacted my landlord, asking if I could get rid of the mirror. He hesitated before answering, telling me that the mirror was a part of the apartment. Previous tenants left it, but it's best you don't disturb it, he said, his voice cautious. That was all he would say. Unwilling to spend another night with that thing, I moved out the next day, leaving the mirror behind. I couldn't get the image of that smile out of my head, and sometimes, in moments when I catch myself in the mirror, I can almost feel it staring back at me. Even now, I still wonder who, or what, was looking out at me from behind that glass. I work late nights in the city, and on most evenings, I'm able to catch the last train home. The city's underground tunnels are old, winding beneath skyscrapers and rivers. Riding the empty train at night has always felt a bit unsettling, but I'm used to the routine. The low hum of the engine, the empty stations flashing by, and the occasional flickering lights in the dark tunnels. But one night, something changed, and I still haven't been able to explain it. That evening, I was exhausted, drifting in and out of sleep as the train rattled along the tracks. The car was empty except for me, and as the train pulled into each station, the lights on the platform would flash briefly before disappearing into darkness again. But at one stop, I noticed something strange. Just as the train began to pull away, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the platform, their face obscured in shadow. They didn't board the train, didn't even move, just stood still watching. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as a trick of the light. But at the next station I saw them again. The same figure standing in the exact same place, only closer to the edge. This time I could make out more details. They were tall, dressed in a long, dark coat, with their face turned slightly down so I couldn't see any features. It was as if they'd been waiting there for a long time, but they still didn't get on the train. By the third station, my nerves were on edge. I stared out the window, half expecting to see the figure again. And there they were, this time right at the very edge of the platform, only a few inches away from the passing train. I could almost feel their gaze fixed on me, even though I couldn't make out any features. My hands began to tremble as I looked away, not wanting to catch their eye. When the train pulled out of the station, I was relieved, hoping I'd left them behind. But as we entered the next tunnel, the lights in the car began to flicker, casting long shadows that made the empty car seem even darker. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a power surge, but then I heard something that sent a chill down my spine, a soft tapping coming from the window opposite me. I turned slowly, heart pounding, and saw a faint outline in the glass. It was the figure from the platform, only now they were outside the train, somehow keeping pace as the train sped through the tunnel. Their face was turned toward the window, their hand pressed against the glass as if trying to reach through. I couldn't see any features, only a pair of dark, empty eyes staring at me from outside the moving train. I panicked, stumbling out of my seat and moving to the next car. My footsteps echoed as I passed through the empty train, but every time I looked back, I caught a glimpse of that shadowy figure outside the window, keeping up effortlessly, face still pressed against the glass. I finally reached the front of the train, breathing heavily as I burst into the conductor's compartment. The conductor looked up, surprised by my appearance. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but he just shook his head, looking at me with a strange, almost pitying expression. "There's no one else on this train but you," he said, "and there hasn't been anyone on the platforms tonight either. The stations are empty." My heart pounded as I looked back at the cars behind me. The conductor was wrong. I'd seen them clear as day. I tried to argue, but he waved me off, muttering about overworked imagination and gesturing for me to return to my seat. Reluctantly, I made my way back through the cars, each one emptier and darker than before. I avoided the windows, trying not to think about what I'd seen. But as I sat down, something caught my eye. The seat across from me was wet, a small puddle forming on the worn cushion, like someone had been sitting there, dripping water onto the floor. I glanced at the window, and there, in the glass, I saw them again, their reflection faint but unmistakable, sitting directly across from me, their heads slightly tilted as if studying me. The train lights flickered again, and the figure's face appeared clearer in the brief moments of light. Dark, empty eyes set into a face pale and hollow, like something long dead. I shut my eyes, hoping it would go away. The train slowed, pulling into the final station. I stood up, clutching my bag, ready to bolt as soon as the doors opened. The lights flickered one last time, and for a split second, I saw the figure standing right beside me, their hand outstretched, fingers inches from my shoulder. The doors opened and I ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty station. I glanced back once, and through the closing doors I saw them still inside the car, watching me with that same lifeless stare. I never took the last train home again. And sometimes, late at night, when I pass the station, I think I can see a figure standing at the edge of the platform, waiting just out of the corner of my eye. I live alone in a small cottage just outside a quiet town in Maine. It's a charming place with a small garden, surrounded by woods, and my closest neighbors live about half a mile away. It's usually peaceful here, the kind of place where you can hear the wind rustling through the trees or the occasional owl hooting in the night. I moved here a few years ago, hoping to escape the noise of city life, and most of the time I don't regret it. But one night, a few months ago, made me question my choice. It was a Wednesday night. I remember because I had just finished a late-night conference call and was unwinding on the couch, scrolling through social media on my phone. The time was probably around 11:30 p.m. when I started hearing this faint, steady tapping noise. At first, I thought it might just be branches scraping against the window. But as I listened more closely, I realized it was too rhythmic to be random. Tap, tap, pause. Then again tap, tap. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was persistent, almost like it was intentional. I set my phone down and listened, hoping it would stop on its own. It didn't. Instead, it got louder, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the noise was coming from my front door. Curious and a bit unnerved, I got up, walked to the door, and stood there for a moment, debating whether I should look through the peephole. I tried to convince myself it was probably just some neighborhood prank, maybe some kids messing around. But then, why would they be out here in the middle of nowhere? I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pressed my eye to the peephole. Standing on the other side of the door, directly in front of me, was a person. They were wearing a hooded sweatshirt with the hood pulled up so I couldn't see their face. The porch light cast a dim glow around them, but their head was angled down, and their face was hidden in shadow. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it could just be someone who needed help, maybe someone whose car had broken down nearby. But it was late, and their posture, motionless with their head down, didn't look like they were in need of assistance. It felt wrong, very wrong. I called out through the door, my voice shaky, asking if they needed help. There was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't react in any way. They just stood there perfectly still. "Can I help you?" I called out again, louder this time, trying to sound more assertive. Still, there was no response, just the quiet, oppressive silence pressing down on me. My heart was pounding by this point, and a part of me wanted to throw open the door and confront this person. But instinct held me back. Instead, I reached for my phone, ready to call the police, when I heard it again. The tapping. Tap, tap. But this time it was louder, as if they were pressing harder against the door. I was breathing hard, trying to keep calm. I asked one last time, trying to sound as authoritative as possible, "If you don't answer, I'll have to call the police." That's when they finally reacted. I heard the faintest sound, a sort of quiet exhale, almost like a sigh. Then they turned slowly, took a few steps backward, and disappeared off my porch and into the darkness beyond the reach of my porch light. Relieved, I watched as the shadow melted into the night, but a strange feeling lingered. I stood there, gripping my phone, staring out into the darkness, wondering if they'd really gone. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept checking the peephole, hoping and dreading that they wouldn't return. The next morning I checked the porch. There were no signs anyone had been there, no footprints, no scuff marks. It was like the whole thing had never happened. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just some prankster, maybe even a dream, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. For the next few days I was on edge. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder and checking the windows. My peaceful little cottage didn't feel so safe anymore. Then, a few days later, I got a notification from my security camera. I had almost forgotten about the camera I'd installed by the front door, figuring it would only catch images of deer or the occasional raccoon. I logged into the app to check, more out of habit than anything else. But as I reviewed the footage from that night, I noticed something strange. From 11:30 p.m. onward, the footage was completely black. The camera should have recorded the porch light and anyone who walked up to the door, but instead, there was nothing but static and darkness, as if the camera had been turned off. My heart sank as I realized that the camera had somehow malfunctioned, or had been tampered with. I called the company to see if they could explain it, but they couldn't find anything wrong with the device. They offered to send someone out to replace it, but they couldn't tell me why it would have gone dark at that specific time. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checked the camera, and tried to sleep. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of a soft tap, tap, tap on my front door again. This time, I didn't look through the peephole. I sat there in bed, paralyzed, as the tapping grew louder and faster, like whoever was on the other side was becoming more and more impatient. My phone was in my hand, and I was moments from dialing 911 when it suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was almost more unnerving than the noise itself. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to move, wondering if it would start again. But it didn't. I never heard the tapping again after that night. Days later, when I finally felt brave enough to open the door and check, I found a single note wedged between the door frame and the screen door. It was a small, dirty scrap of paper with a single line scrawled across it in scratchy handwriting. "I know you're in there." To this day, I have no idea who was on the other side of that door or what they wanted. But I still live in that cottage, though I don't sleep as easily as I once did. And every time I hear a noise in the night, I hold my breath, hoping it's just the wind. It was past midnight and I was exhausted after a late shift. The road home was dark and nearly empty, a winding stretch of highway flanked by dense woods. My eyes felt heavy as I drove, but the thought of my bed kept me going. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed headlights behind me. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was just another late-night driver. But a few minutes later, as I made a left turn down a side road to take a shortcut, those headlights followed. Felt strange. The car didn't just follow me, it mirrored my exact moves, keeping the same distance. I made another sharp right, taking a less direct route, and to my unease, the headlights stayed with me, turning just as sharply. My pulse quickened. I thought maybe, just maybe, I was being paranoid, but I wanted to be sure. I decided to test it. I accelerated suddenly, almost flooring the gas pedal as my car roared down the empty road. The headlights fell back just a bit and I felt a surge of relief. But then the other car picked up speed too, creeping back up until they were right behind me again, closer than before. That's when I realized they were following me. Every instinct screamed at me to lose them. I sped up, my hands gripping the wheel tightly as I swerved around corners and hugged the curves of the road, hoping they'd back off. But the car only came closer, headlights glaring so bright that my rearview mirror turned into a blinding white haze. My mind was racing. Who were they? What did they want? I could feel the panic clawing up my throat as the other car began to flash their high beams, flicking them on and off in a slow, menacing rhythm. It wasn't just random, it was deliberate, calculated. They wanted me to know they were right there and they weren't letting go. I needed to think fast. I couldn't keep driving blindly. There was a gas station a couple of miles up the road. It was a long shot, but I decided to try and get there. I kept my speed up, hearing the engine strain as I pushed it as fast as I could. The car behind me matched my speed effortlessly, their headlights unwavering, the beams now almost burning into my rear window. It felt like they were close enough to tap my bumper. The road stretched ahead in a long, dark ribbon, and the gas station came into view like a flickering beacon. I swerved into the parking lot, tires screeching as I parked under the single, harsh fluorescent light. My heart pounded as I glanced at the convenience store, closed, dark windows reflecting the empty lot. There wasn't a soul around. I was completely alone. I watched, breath held, as the car behind me slowed and turned into the lot. They didn't pull up next to me. Instead, they parked across the lot, headlights off, leaving them as a shadowy silhouette barely visible in the dim light. The engine idled for a few seconds, then shut off. They were just sitting there, watching. I locked the doors, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, waiting, every nerve in my body on edge. The silence was suffocating. I didn't dare move, didn't dare even blink. Minutes passed. I thought about calling the police, but my hands were shaking so hard I could barely keep a hold of my phone. And what would I tell them? That a car was parked in a gas station lot? It felt ridiculous, but the fear gnawing at my gut told me this wasn't just paranoia. Then the car's headlights suddenly flicked back on, blindingly bright. I shielded my eyes, trying to peer past the glare, but it was impossible to make out any details. They just sat there, lights blazing, almost taunting me. And then they moved. Slowly, the car began to inch forward, crossing the lot at a crawl, aiming directly at me. My heart pounded as I watched them come closer, the headlights illuminating my car in a harsh, merciless glow. I felt trapped, like a rabbit caught in a hunter's sights. I fumbled to put my car into gear, preparing to bolt out of the lot, but just as quickly as they'd started, the car suddenly stopped. They sat there, headlights on, idling barely 10 feet away. I could feel their presence through the glass, the weight of their gaze even though I couldn't see their face. Just as the panic was about to tip me over the edge, the driver's side door of the other car opened. My breath hitched as I watched a figure step out, a tall, shadowy silhouette backlit by the headlights. I couldn't make out any details, only the outline of someone standing, motionless, facing my car. I was frozen, gripped by fear. The person just stood there, making no move to come closer, no attempt to speak. They stood perfectly still, as if waiting, watching me struggle under the weight of their silent threat. Then, in one quick movement, they reached back into the car, slammed the door, and climbed back in. They paused, almost like they were giving me one last look, one last chance to take in the sight of them. And then, without a sound, the car's headlights shut off, and they reversed, backing out of the parking lot. I sat there, paralyzed, watching as they turned back onto the highway and disappeared into the night. My chest felt tight, each breath coming fast and shallow as the shock wore off. When I finally dared to move, I scrambled to lock my doors again, even though they were already locked. I glanced down at my phone, and my hands trembled as I finally dialed 911. But when the dispatcher answered, I couldn't get the words out. I sat there, staring out into the empty road, realizing that it was over, and that they were gone. The police arrived about 15 minutes later, and I told them what I could, though it sounded ridiculous even to me. A car following me? A person who just stared? The officers were kind, but I could tell they were skeptical. They took my report, advised me to be careful, and said they'd keep an eye out on the highway that night, but there wasn't much they could do. I drove home with my heart still racing, glancing at my mirrors every few seconds, bracing myself for the sight of those headlights coming up behind me again. But they never did. To this day, I don't know who was in that car, or why they decided to follow me. But now, every time I'm out on those dark, empty roads, I can't shake the feeling that someone is just behind me, watching, waiting, ready to flick their headlights on and remind me that they're still out there, somewhere in the night. I used to take the late bus home after work, the kind that only runs a few times after midnight. The bus stop was always deserted at that hour, a lonely patch of concrete under a flickering streetlight. It was the only place to catch the last bus that would drop me off near my apartment. Usually, I was alone, with only the hum of the distant traffic and the occasional gust of wind for company. One night, as I walked toward the stop, I noticed someone already standing there. It was unusual. I rarely saw anyone waiting at this time. The figure was tall, wearing a long dark coat that seemed to blend into the shadows. They stood perfectly still, facing away from the streetlight, head slightly bowed as if lost in thought. I felt a pang of unease as I approached but pushed it aside. It was just another commuter, I told myself, someone like me who had stayed out too late. Still, something about the stranger seemed off, an unnatural stillness that sent a chill through me. I took a spot a few feet away and waited, trying not to stare. As the minutes dragged on, the stranger never moved, not even a shift in posture. The streetlight above flickered occasionally, casting strange, distorted shadows around him. I glanced over a few times, expecting to see some sign of life, a shuffle, a cough, anything, but there was nothing. It was like standing next to a statue. Finally, the bus arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I turned to board, relieved to leave the unsettling figure behind. But as I stepped onto the bus and glanced back, the stranger was gone. I blinked, confused. He had been there just seconds before, standing in that same spot. There was no sound of footsteps, no indication of where he could have gone. The street was empty, stretching off into the darkness. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself it was nothing, just someone who had left quietly. But as the bus drove away, I couldn't help but feel a pair of eyes watching me from somewhere in the shadows. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice him more often. He was always there at the bus stop when I arrived, standing in that same unnervingly still posture, never turning to look at me, never acknowledging my presence. I tried different routes, leaving work at different times, but it didn't matter. He was always there waiting. One night, I decided to test something. I arrived earlier than usual, hoping to get to the stop before he did. But as I turned the corner, my heart sank. He was already there, standing in his usual spot, as if he had been waiting for me specifically. This time, I could feel a cold sweat on my skin, a growing sense of dread that I couldn't explain. I kept my distance, pretending to ignore him, but I could feel his presence looming, an oppressive weight in the otherwise empty street. The bus was late that night, and the longer I stood there, the heavier the air seemed to grow. I could hear my own breathing, the pounding of my heart, but the stranger remained utterly silent. Finally, the bus came into view, its lights casting long shadows as it approached. But as it neared the stop, something strange happened. The bus's headlights seemed to flicker, and for a brief moment, the stranger's face was illuminated. What I saw sent a wave of cold terror through me. His face was not just pale, it was lifeless, almost wax-like, with eyes that were dark hollows staring back at me. There were no pupils, no irises, just two black pits where his eyes should have been. And yet, despite the lack of features, I could feel his gaze, a piercing, hungry stare that seemed to burrow into my soul. I stumbled back, nearly missing my step as the bus doors opened. I scrambled on, not daring to look back, my heart racing. The bus driver gave me a strange look, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. I just wanted to get away, to leave that terrifying figure behind. As the bus pulled away, I couldn't resist one last glance out the window. The stranger was still there, standing in the same spot, but now he was facing me. His dark, hollow eyes seemed to follow the bus as it drove away, unblinking, as if marking my departure. I got home that night and bolted my door, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion, a trick of the light, maybe even a nightmare that had bled into reality. But the image of that hollow-eyed face stayed with me, haunting my thoughts, making it hard to sleep. The next night, I decided to take a cab instead of the bus, unwilling to face whatever was waiting for me at that stop. But as we drove past, I couldn't help but look. The bus stop was empty, save for the faint glow of the flickering streetlight. For a moment, I felt relief wash over me, until I saw him standing at the next intersection, as if he had moved ahead, waiting, always one step closer. Now, I no longer take the bus at night. I avoid that stop, that part of town, but it doesn't matter. Sometimes, when I'm alone on a quiet street, I catch a glimpse of a figure in the corner of my eye, standing unnaturally still. I tell myself it's just my imagination, just a shadow, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for me to stop, waiting for me to look back. I've always been a night owl. My job often kept me up late, and by the time I got home, the world was quiet, everyone else asleep. To fill the silence, I would turn on my old radio, tuning it to a station that played soft jazz or the occasional late-night talk show. The static and soft melodies were comforting, a background hum that kept the loneliness at bay. One night, after an especially long shift, I was too tired to do anything but collapse into my favorite chair with a cup of tea. I turned on the radio, expecting the usual faint jazz or the chatter of insomniac hosts. But instead, all I got was static. Annoyed, I fiddled with the dial, trying to find a station, but every channel was the same, a harsh, endless hiss. Just as I was about to turn it off, I heard something. It was faint, almost drowned out by the static, but unmistakably there, a voice. I leaned closer, turning the volume up, trying to catch what was being said. The words were distorted, garbled, like they were being spoken from a great distance. But there was something oddly familiar about the tone. At first, I thought it was just interference, maybe someone broadcasting from a shortwave radio. But the voice grew clearer, cutting through the static in an unnaturally smooth tone. My skin prickled as I realized it wasn't just random noise, it was speaking directly to me. The words were jumbled, fragments of sentences that didn't quite make sense, but the tone was calm, almost soothing. "I see you, alone, listening," it whispered, the voice crackling through the static like a distant echo. I froze, my blood running cold. I glanced around my dimly lit living room, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but I was alone. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was tired and hearing things. But the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "You can't hide. I know you're listening," it said, each word drawn out, distorted by the crackle of the radio. I turned the dial frantically, trying to change the station, but no matter where I tuned, the voice followed, whispering through the static, a quiet, relentless presence. It was as though the radio was locked onto that voice, refusing to let go. I turned off the radio, the silence of the room feeling heavier than before. I could still hear the faint echo of the voice in my mind, like it had imprinted itself into my thoughts. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a strange broadcast, an audio glitch. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way it seemed to know I was there, the way it addressed me directly. The next night, I hesitated before turning the radio back on. Part of me didn't want to, but the silence was too overwhelming. I needed the distraction. At first, it was just static again, the familiar hiss filling the room. But then, slowly, the voice returned. This time, it was clearer, more distinct. "You can't turn it off," it whispered, almost as if it were laughing softly. "I'm always here." The words sent chills down my spine. I yanked the plug from the wall, the radio going dead instantly. For a moment, I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to shake off the fear that clung to me. But then I heard it again. Faint but unmistakable, the voice coming from the unplugged radio. "You think you're safe?" it asked, the static crackling softly around its words. "I'm closer than you think." I stumbled back, my heart racing. How was it still playing? The radio was off, disconnected, but the voice continued, soft and persistent, whispering things I couldn't quite understand. It was as if it was trying to reach me, to pull me into some unseen place. I couldn't sleep that night, the whispers from the radio echoing in my mind long after I had thrown it into the closet. Even with it shut away, I could still hear faint murmurs coming from behind the closed door, like the voice was trying to seep through the walls. Days turned into weeks, and the voice never truly left me. I would hear it in the quiet moments, in the soft hum of my refrigerator, or the gentle hiss of the shower. It was always there, waiting, whispering words I couldn't quite make out, but that filled me with a deep, unshakable dread. I eventually threw the radio out, desperate to rid myself of whatever was haunting it. But it didn't matter. The voice was still there, in the corners of my apartment, in the white noise of everyday life, waiting for those quiet moments when I was alone. Now, I avoid anything that produces static. No radios, no old TVs, no speakers. But it doesn't help. The voice finds a way. It's always there, lurking in the background, waiting to whisper my name, to remind me that it's still listening, always closer than I think. I had always found solace by the water, and that's why I rented a small cabin by a secluded lake for a weekend getaway. The area was peaceful, surrounded by dense forest, far away from the noise of the city. The lake was a perfect, undisturbed mirror, reflecting the sky and trees with an almost dreamlike clarity. It was exactly the kind of solitude I needed. The first evening, I settled into the cabin and decided to take a walk along the shore before sunset. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. The lake was so still it looked like a sheet of glass, perfectly reflecting the twilight sky. I watched as the colors shifted from orange to deep blue, the surface almost glowing in the fading light. As I walked along the shore, something caught my eye, a dark shape in the water, almost directly across from where I stood. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of a tree or a cloud, but the shape didn't move as the wind rippled the surface. It was faint but unmistakably human-shaped, like a person standing just beneath the water's surface. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light. But when I looked again, the shape was still there, dark and unmoving. I stared at it for a while, trying to convince myself it was just a shadow or an optical illusion. But there was something unsettling about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Trying to shake off the eerie feeling, I turned back to the cabin as darkness began to settle over the lake. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the dark shape from my mind. It lingered behind my eyelids whenever I closed my eyes, filling my dreams with strange, disjointed scenes of the lake under a moonless sky. The next morning, I decided to explore the other side of the lake where I had seen the shape. The air was heavy with mist, and everything was eerily silent, as if the world was holding its breath. As I made my way to the opposite shore, I noticed the water was darker there, almost murky despite the lake's usual clarity. I stood at the edge, staring into the water, half expecting to see the shape again. But there was nothing, just the faint ripple of water lapping against the shore. I told myself I had imagined it, that it was just a trick of light and reflection. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, but the lake was as still as ever. Yet, in the water's reflection, I thought I saw a shadow standing behind me, right where I was standing on the shore. I turned quickly, but the shoreline was empty. My heart pounded as I stared into the water again. This time, the reflection showed only me alone. Unnerved, I hurried back to the cabin, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. I spent the rest of the day indoors, refusing to look out the windows that faced the lake. But as evening came, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped out onto the porch to watch the sunset, keeping my eyes away from the water. But the moment I glanced at the lake, my blood ran cold. There, in the center of the lake, was the dark shape again. It was clearer now, its outline sharper. It wasn't just a shadow, it was the reflection of a person standing perfectly upright, staring back at me from the surface. But when I looked directly at the water, there was nothing there. The reflection existed only on the lake's surface, like some kind of dark mirage. The figure didn't move, didn't waver, even as the wind began to pick up and the water rippled. It was as if it were anchored to the lake's reflection, something that existed solely within that mirrored world. I backed away slowly, my pulse racing, and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing soft splashing sounds outside, like someone wading through the water. Each time I worked up the courage to peek through the curtains, the lake looked as still as ever. But the splashing would start again as soon as I turned away, like some cruel game. By the time dawn broke, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed up my things hastily, refusing to look at the lake again. But as I loaded my car, I couldn't resist one last glance. The lake was calm, the morning sun casting a golden glow over the surface. For a moment, I almost believed I had imagined the whole thing. But then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. The reflection of the dark figure was still there, standing at the water's edge, exactly where I had been the day before. But now it was closer, almost at the shore, its head tilted slightly as if watching me. I turned and drove away, the image of that dark figure seared into my mind. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me, that it was trying to lure me closer to the water. And sometimes when I pass by a lake or a still pond, I catch myself glancing at the reflections, searching for that dark shape, terrified that it's still out there, waiting for me to return. I've always loved the quiet solitude of libraries, especially in the late hours when most people have gone home. There's a certain peace that comes with being surrounded by rows upon rows of books, the soft hum of fluorescent lights, and the distant creaking of old floorboards. I often stayed late at my local library, working on my research or simply reading, enjoying the silence that settled over the place after dark. One evening, I lost track of time and realized that I was one of the last people left. The librarian gave me a polite reminder that they would be closing soon, so I gathered my things and made my way toward the exit. But just as I was about to leave, I remembered a book I needed for a project. The section it was in was at the far end of the library, a part that was always dimly lit and rarely used. I made my way down the aisles, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The lights flickered occasionally, casting strange, shifting shadows on the shelves. As I reached the section I needed, I felt a sudden chill, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. I brushed it off as my imagination and focused on finding the book. That's when I noticed it, out of the corner of my eye, A dark shape flickered past the end of the aisle. I turned quickly, expecting to see another late-night reader or a staff member, but the aisle was empty. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the library was completely silent except for the faint buzz of the lights overhead. I convinced myself it was just the trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flickering bulbs. But as I turned back to the shelf, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my hands trembled slightly as I reached for the book. The sense of being observed was almost palpable, a weight pressing against my back. With the book in hand, I hurried back toward the front of the library, eager to leave the eerie quiet of the stacks behind. But as I reached the main aisle, I saw it again, a shadow darting across the floor just beyond the rows of bookshelves. It moved too quickly to be a person, a dark blur that seemed to melt into the surrounding shadows. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, maybe just a trick of my tired mind. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was no one else here. The library was supposed to be empty except for me and the staff, and they had already locked the front doors. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move, quickening my pace as I made my way toward the exit. The shadows seemed to grow darker around me, the flickering lights casting distorted shapes that danced along the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Just as I reached the front desk, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was soft, like the rustle of pages, but with a strange, almost human quality to it. I turned around, scanning the darkened rows of shelves behind me, but saw nothing. The whisper came again, this time clearer, like someone muttering just out of earshot. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just the old building settling, the sound of air moving through the vents. But as I turned to leave, I saw a shadow slip across the floor, this time closer, moving with a fluid, unnatural grace. It didn't have the shape of a person. It was darker, more amorphous, like a patch of night that had somehow come to life. I rushed toward the exit, heart racing, barely able to keep my hands steady enough to unlock the door. As I stepped out into the cold night air, I took a deep breath, the feeling of relief washing over me. But just as I was about to leave, I made the mistake of glancing back through the glass doors. The library was dark, the lights now turned off. But in the faint glow of the emergency exit signs, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the aisle where I had been moments before. It was tall and thin, its edges blurred as if it were made of smoke, yet its presence was unmistakably real. It didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there, staring at me, or at least I felt it was, even though it had no visible eyes. I turned and ran, the image of that shadow burned into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me even as I drove away, that it knew I had seen it and was waiting for me to come back. I tried to forget about it, to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I couldn't stop thinking about that shadow, about the way it seemed to defy the light, existing in a place where shadows shouldn't be. A week later, I went back to the library, hoping that I could put the whole thing behind me. Everything seemed normal at first, brightly lit, filled with people going about their business. But as I wandered through the shelves, I noticed something odd. In the corner of my eye, I could still see it, that dark shape lurking just beyond the rows of books. Now, every time I visit the library, I can feel it there, hiding among the shelves, waiting in the dim corners. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, I hear that faint whisper again, like a forgotten secret carried on the wind, reminding me that it's still watching, still waiting in the shadows. I've always enjoyed walking home after work. My shift ended late, long after the city had fallen quiet and the streets were usually deserted. The route I took was mostly residential, a series of winding streets lined with old houses and occasional patches of trees. The only illumination came from the scattered streetlights that cast pale, flickering light on the empty sidewalks. It started one night when I was walking my usual route. As I turned a corner, I noticed a figure standing beneath one of the streetlights a few blocks away. It was hard to make out any details from that distance, but they were perfectly still, just standing there in the dim yellow light. At first, I didn't think much of it, probably just someone waiting for a ride or out for a late-night walk like me. But as I got closer, the figure remained motionless, not shifting or fidgeting like people usually do. Something about their stillness sent a shiver down my spine. I kept walking, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that was building in my chest. As I approached, I realized that the person was standing in the very center of the light's glow, head tilted slightly forward as if staring directly at the ground. I couldn't see their face, it was hidden in shadows, but I could feel their gaze even though their eyes were pointed down. I hurried past, pretending not to notice, my heart pounding in my chest. As I moved beyond the circle of light, I couldn't resist the urge to glance back. The figure was still there, but now it seemed like they had turned slightly, as if they were watching me walk away. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. For a few nights, I didn't see the figure again and began to convince myself it had just been my imagination. But the unease lingered, and I found myself glancing nervously at every streetlight I passed, half expecting to see that shadowy figure waiting beneath it. Then, a week later, I saw them again. This time, they were standing beneath a different streetlight farther down my route. The same eerie stillness, the same bowed head. It was as if they knew where I would be, waiting in just the right spot. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look directly at them as I walked past. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, tracking my movements with their hidden eyes. Each night after that, the figure appeared at a new streetlight along my route home. Always standing perfectly still, always under the dim glow, as if that circle of light was the only place they could exist. I tried taking different routes, hoping to avoid them, but somehow they always found me, always knew where to stand. The more it happened, the more the fear gnawed at me. Who were they? Why were they always there, always watching but never moving? I even considered calling the police, but what could I tell them? That someone was standing under a streetlight? It sounded absurd, paranoid, like I was imagining things. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I was tired of feeling afraid, tired of the relentless stalking. As I turned the corner and saw the figure standing under the usual streetlight, I forced myself to approach them. My hands were trembling, my breath shallow, but I was determined to confront whoever, or whatever, it was. The closer I got, the more I realized how wrong everything felt. The air was colder around them, the light above flickering erratically, casting strange, distorted shadows. The figure remained perfectly still, not acknowledging my approach. As I drew near, I could finally make out some details. Their clothing seemed dated, tattered, as if they had stepped out of another time. And their skin, it was impossibly pale, almost translucent under the flickering light. I stopped a few feet away, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure's head was still bowed, eyes hidden beneath the shadows. Summoning all my courage, I took a step closer, trying to see their face. That's when they moved. Their heads snapped up, revealing eyes that were black. No whites, no irises, just dark, endless pits that seemed to swallow the light. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, trapped in their gaze. It was like staring into a void, something that shouldn't exist, something that was beyond human. A twisted smile slowly spread across their face, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me, a terror so deep it seemed to paralyze my entire body. I stumbled back, my legs weak, turning and sprinting down the street, not daring to look back. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, slow and steady, keeping pace no matter how fast I ran. I reached my apartment, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my heart racing, my mind spinning. For hours I sat there, listening for any sound, any sign that they had followed me home. But all I heard was the pounding of my own heart. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a nightmare, a trick of the light and my exhausted mind. But deep down, I knew it was real. I could still feel the cold grip of their gaze, still see those dark, hollow eyes every time I closed my own. Now, every night as I walk home, I keep my eyes forward, refusing to look at the street lights. But sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of a figure standing perfectly still under the pale glow, waiting for me to pass. And I know that one day I'll have to face them again, that they'll be waiting for me at the last street light, where the darkness never truly ends. I had been driving for hours, my eyes burning from the endless miles of highway under the harsh glare of the setting sun. By the time I reached the outskirts of a small, forgotten town, the light had faded into dusk, and exhaustion was clawing at my mind. I knew I needed to stop for the night. That's when I saw it, a run-down old hotel with a faded neon sign blinking vacancy. It wasn't much, but it was the only option in sight. The lobby was dimly lit, filled with the musty scent of old carpet and furniture that had seen better days. The receptionist, an older man with a tired expression, barely looked up as I checked in. I was given a key to room 203 on the second floor. I remember feeling a strange chill when I touched the key, the metal cold in a way that didn't quite make sense. The hallway leading to my room was narrow, lined with peeling wallpaper and dim lights that flickered occasionally. It was the kind of place where time seemed to have stopped decades ago. I finally reached my room, unlocked the door, and stepped inside, hoping for a few hours of undisturbed sleep. The room was small and sparsely furnished. A single bed, a worn-out chair, and a dresser covered in dust. The wallpaper was faded, and the air had that stale scent of a place that hadn't been aired out in a long time. The only source of light was a dim lamp that cast a sickly yellow glow. I set my bag down and went to check the bathroom. That's when I first noticed it, the large mirror above the bathroom sink. Its surface was cloudy, almost as if someone had tried to wipe it clean but failed. I rubbed at the glass with my sleeve, but the smudges wouldn't disappear. It was as though the stains were trapped beneath the surface, permanent scars on the mirror's face. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that gnawed at me. I was tired, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. I decided to take a quick shower to wash away the grime of the road. As the hot water ran over me, the small bathroom filled with steam, fogging up the already murky mirror even more. When I stepped out of the shower, wiping steam from my eyes, I glanced at the mirror again. My reflection was there, but something seemed off. The fog had cleared enough that I could see my face, but the background, the room behind me, looked darker, almost distorted, as if the mirror reflected not just my room but some shadowy version of it. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just the poor lighting. I turned away and got dressed, trying to focus on getting some rest. But as I turned off the lights and lay down, the unease lingered. It was the kind of feeling that crawls under your skin, making it impossible to relax. Every creak of the old building, every rustle of the wind outside seemed magnified in the darkness. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to the sound of a soft, rhythmic tapping. My eyes shot open and I lay there listening intently. The sound was faint, but it was definitely coming from inside the room. Tap, tap, tap. I strained to hear, my heart pounding in the silence. It sounded like fingers tapping on glass. Swallowing hard, I reached for the lamp beside the bed and turned it on. The dim yellow light flickered to life, casting a weak glow around the room. Everything looked the same, nothing out of place. But the tapping continued, soft and deliberate. It was coming from the bathroom. I got up slowly, every nerve in my body screaming for me to just leave, to walk out and never look back. But I couldn't stop myself. I walked toward the bathroom door, the tapping growing louder with each step. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the sound stopped abruptly. The bathroom was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing: the mirror. The surface was clearer now, as if someone had wiped away the fog. I stepped closer, staring into the glass. My reflection stared back, but behind me, in the dim light, I could see a dark shadow standing in the corner of the room. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the small, empty bathroom. My heart was racing, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I turned back to the mirror, and that's when I saw it, The shadow was still there in the reflection, unmoving, watching me. It was closer now, almost as if it had taken a step forward while my back was turned. I stumbled out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, my tired mind playing games. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room. The air felt heavier, the shadows seemed darker, more oppressive. I packed my bag in a frenzy, deciding I would rather drive through the night than spend another moment in that room. As I was about to leave, I glanced at the bathroom door one last time. The tapping had started again, slow and rhythmic. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me. I turned the knob and opened the door. The mirror was completely clear now, and the shadow was gone. But etched into the glass, where the smudges had been, were words that hadn't been there before. "You can't leave. Not yet." Panic surged through me, and I bolted out of the room, down the hallway, and into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, desperate to escape. As I sped away from that old hotel, I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But the road was empty, just darkness stretching endlessly behind me. Even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home. At night, I still hear that soft tapping sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the bathroom mirror. I refuse to look, afraid of what I might see staring back at me. Alright, that's all the stories for today. I'm so glad you stayed with me until the end. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.